From a very young age, when I started writing, the idea of storytelling was one of transcribing images into words. Uh, and this was until my uncle had pointed out that there might come a time, or there will come a time in the future, where I will be more excited by stories as opposed to words. I would be more excited by where my characters are going to go as opposed to what they're doing or how best to describe their hair, their clothes, their eyes, the coal. And so the journey of storytelling for me has been trying to figure out the trade off between, and there is a trade off between describing the beauty of the moment and describing the beauty of a journey, and trying to see if over the course of time a balance can be struck between the two, uh, giving both as much importance as it needs, hoping that one doesn't overshadow the other into, I don't know, sort of crumbling dust. But yeah, I think broadly this is what creativity, storytelling means to me.
Hey everyone, welcome to the Closet Writer Chronicles. I'm your host Sangeeta, aka the Moody Marshmallow. You just heard our guest for today, Prathyush Parasuraman. Prathyush is a culture writer and film critic. He has been published by Film Companion, First Post, and The Hindu. He has also assisted with research for the book Queristan by Parmesh Shahani. Before all this, Prathyush graduated with a BA in Economics and South Asian Studies from the University of California, Berkeley, and worked with the Abdul Latif Jameel Poverty Action Lab, popularly known as JPAL. Tune in to hear about his fascinating journey and his thoughts on a variety of subjects. Hi everyone, welcome to the Closet Writer Chronicles. This week I have with me Prathyush Parasuraman. Welcome to the show, Prathyush. It is so good to have you here.
Thank you, Sangeeta.
So, Prathyush, I mean, you have a really interesting sort of career trajectory, which we'll get into. But the first thing I want to ask you is what is your earliest memory of being creative and when did you start writing?
It's a little complicated. I'm not able to put chronology to it, but it's just impressions that I'll give you, if that's fine. So I've been writing short stories for a very long time, and by a very long time, I mean from the age of 8 or 9. And when I say short stories, I don't mean good short stories. I mean words put together in sentences that can be somewhat read. And these short stories invariably came from images that I used to obsess over. And these images could be of a lot of it was the films that I was watching, like an image that would strike me. And then I would weave a different story around that image. A lot of it used to be calendar art. I used to be very taken by the pitchwise of Krishna that I had seen growing up, and those images of the Leela that used to happen. And I had written quite a few stories just riffing off of that. Again, I have to be very clear, these were awful stories because I was revisiting some of them recently and I was like, my God. Uh, but the point was that these were images that I was somewhat trying to transcribe almost through these stories. And so they were very descriptive. There was not much events happening. It was just a lot of static images which in my head were, they were sort of staining my consciousness in some sense because I was not able to sort of get rid of it. And I remember, of course, when you're a child, you're very excited and you think you're the best writer and the best poet and the best painter. And so I was making everyone read these stories. And my uncle, I remember at that time, who had read it, and he said, uh, there will come a time, and I remember this very clearly, that there will come a time when you will not be excited about words as much as you are about story, in the sense that I used to love certain words and I used to use them. And I used to just
Okay.
be excited by being able to use those words in a sentence, right? Like oblivion, for example. Using it in a sentence would give me a high. And he had told me that there will come a time when you'll be excited by the story you're writing and not the words you're using to express that story. And that was a very formative criticism almost that I've held on to for a very long time. But the cut and thrust of it is was just that I was obsessed with images. I was very I used to be moved by color a lot. Remember when we used to travel uh in Tamil Nadu near Madurai, the houses used to be very, very colorful. Like they would
Yeah.
paint their houses in these garish hues of like copper sulfate blue, rose syrup pink. There used to be this like dusty yellow, uh, pista green. And when we used to, so I had just inherited my father's camera at that time, an SLR, and where you can change uh, the shutter speed. And so when the car
Yeah.
was moving, I was able to actually take static photos of these houses, and I sort of came back home and sort of collected all of these and put them into a folder. And my parents were like, "What is he up to?" Because it makes no sense, right? Just taking photos of facades of houses, which were quite generic looking, I suppose. But like I said, just the colors in them would move me in a way few things have. And that obsession continues to this day, where I would, like, for example, this painting, I don't know if you can see this one here, is
Yeah.
actually for sunset in Berkeley, where I studied. And I remember the first thing I realized when I moved to Berkeley to study was just the shade of blue in the sky was unlike any shade of blue I had seen. It was like seeing a color for the first time. And I don't know how to just express the sheer absurdity of that moment, right? Like you didn't think this color could exist, but also it's simultaneously very alienating because this is not sunset for you, right? Sunset is a little dusty, a little cloudy, a little. These are not the shades of blue you're used to, and so it was simultaneously full of awe, but also full of alienation. Um, so yeah, so my earliest memories of writing were just trying to transcribe the sensuality and the imagery that I was uh, unintentionally being drawn towards.
Hmm.
Um, and even not just writing, but even thinking about writing, even criticism for that matter. One of my formative moments of criticism, and I'm saying formative, of course, in hindsight, when I was trying to think about like an origin story for like how did I begin to think about criticism, was that in 2007 this film called Saawariya came out.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and we were a family that used to go for all of these movies very regularly, but for some reason that weekend we didn't go for either Saawariya or Om Shanti Om, which released alongside it. And the next day after Diwali, when school opened, my bus buddy had watched Saawariya and he
Okay.
had absolutely detested it.
Okay.
And instead of asking him why he hated it, I told him to narrate the whole film to me.
Hmm.
And
Okay.
so it used to be a 45-minute bus trip back and then 45 minutes back home in the evening. So it used to be in 1 hour normally when on the way back, during which he narrated the whole film to me, okay, scene by scene, and or as much as he remembered. And for him, he sort of gave it a very magic realist touch. Like if you've
Hmm.
seen the film, there is this character played by Zohra Sehgal called
Yeah.
Lillian,
Yeah.
and
I love
she's
Saawariya. I'll just shamelessly say it. I really liked the film when it came out.
it's a film that I will defend to death.
Yeah.
And,
I would
and
too.
just the two of us, not even Bhansali will defend this film.
I really liked it when it came out, and everyone was like, I'm sorry, I enjoyed the film. I'm not even going to deny it.
What was it about the film that moved you, though?
I don't know. I think that was just so. I think, first of all, it was so different from everything commercial that was coming out, in all honesty. And it was so visually stunning, first of all. And I think just to see I don't know, it just worked. And I think the fact that it was kind of like a love story at the core of it, but it was about unrequited love. And I love Zora Sehgal. I think she's amazing as an artist, honestly. So just to see her on screen was just amazing. But yeah, I don't know. There were just so many things that just worked for me. And it just touched me in a way that I was like, oh my God, I love this. And like I could watch this again and still be like, oh my God, this is great. But yeah. And I still go back to that film. Sorry, people. Sorry, haters. But yeah, I do.
If you love Zora Sehgal, you should have. I don't know if you've read the biography by Ritu Menon,
I
Her Life.
haven't. I've been wanting to.
Oh my God, that woman has lived just such a fascinating life. I mean,
I
imagine
know.
traveling at that young age around, being with Uday Shankar and just, in Dresden. And
I
there's
think
something
she's a role
very
model, honestly speaking.
Julian. I mean, even interviews, the way she would talk about having
Yeah.
sex in her 90s
Yeah.
was
I was like, this lady, but we digress coming back.
so the I mean, the thing about that narration was so Lillian essentially is this like in her character Lillian G was this really grumpy woman, and she says, and when Rani Mukherjee is introducing her, she's like, if she likes you, she'll give you a room to stay, and if she doesn't like you, she'll make you chicken tandoori, like as in like she'll tell you to go. And my friend sort of interpreted it as a literal thing that she will transform you into a chicken tandoori. And so when his in his narration, she was this sort of old crooked magician who was so the film was playing very differently in my head, and I loved it. I loved the narration so
Yeah.
much. I was trying to figure out why someone would not like this movie.
Yeah.
And then of course I watched it with that frame in mind, right? And I think when you're young, you are more moved by convictions uh than by just the objective. Well, objective is not the right word, but just like I would not be able to watch anything with a blank slate. I walk in with a very strong conviction, and that conviction stays. If I have to
Hmm.
like a film, I will like that film. Like there's
Okay.
no way and nothing about it that can make me not like that film. It's
Hmm.
this kind of arrogance of youth, I suppose. I don't know what it is, but uh, there was this very strong conviction in me when I walked into Saawariya. So I knew I was going to love the film, and of course I did. And my first, I suppose, act of criticism was trying to defend that movie in
Hmm.
every social situation. So I was
And
one
the
of
music
those.
was great, let me just add.
Yeah, music. My God, that cassette used to play non-stop. The Rasbina Nahi Chain and Sabar Gai, and my mom used to love the song Thode Badmash that
Oh, I love
Bhansali
that song.
composed.
Yeah.
Uh, and so I suppose that was my first act of just trying to figure out if you want to think about criticism as a way of defending the films that you love and others don't, then this was a seminal moment because I was bringing it up constantly in conversations when it was like they would be talking about AI and politics, and I would suddenly just bring in something
Saawariya.
and and defend the film. I don't know if the defense was very effective. I don't think it was, but it just in the act of wanting to stand by a film when no one else was willing to, it sort of made me also feel very interesting. When in that age you love being outside of the
Different.
crowded life. Yeah,
Yeah.
you're like, when people are like, "Oh, I'm weird," and they're saying it with some sense of pride.
Yeah.
I think I was going through that phase also simultaneously. So there was also a bit of pride in this opinion that I was having. So I'm not able to dislodge one from the other. I don't. So
Hmm.
I still don't know if I were to watch it with a blank slate. I know that's not possible, but if I were to in a hypothetical world, I don't know if I would like it or not. But I think all of these came together at a time uh, to sort of cement this idea of beauty in my head, and I suppose that was why I began writing.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Also, can I just say, when you talk, it's like poetry. I'm like, please just keep talking, Prathyush. You just have such a way with words, honestly. But there was so much I resonated with what you were saying. I mean, of course, Savarya, but just the fact that when you said that sometimes you just know that you're going to like something, like a film or a book. And I know I've faced instances about that, because I know films that I knew I was going to love even before going to watch them, and I have. One was, funnily, coincidentally, Savarya. Another one was Bangalore Days, and then most recently was Sita Ramam for me. Like,
Oh,
I just knew I was
Sita.
gonna. I love that movie. I'm sorry. I will defend that film also to like another level. But yeah, I mean, I just knew I was going to love it. So I completely resonated with what you were saying there. But having said that, who are some of your favorite like artists and creators? Because I believe, like, everyone, especially I think when you're a writer, there invariably are people who kind of do influence and impact you, right, on your creative journey or writing journey, so to speak. So who were they for you, and I guess what were pieces of work that really like moved you or have inspired you?
So I've always struggled with this question because I don't consider influence to be so clear
Hmm.
or linear for that matter, right? Like you read something, you're influenced by it, and it moves you, and then you change your writing. Like it's never been like that. But I can tell you examples of me trying to consciously plagiarize other writers' styles
Okay.
to arrive at my own, because I think that's the closest to influence. One was, of course, Julian Barnes, The Sense of an Ending. It's
Hmm.
this lovely novel of friends. It's a very short novel of friends who just grow apart through time, and it's about, of course, the tragedy of time and how, when you are old and you look back on your life can seem so different from actually what it was. In a sense, how memory taints the moment. And a lot of the book is about how they were young, and they would say stuff like, that's so philosophically self-evident. And I loved that phrase, and I started using it completely intentionally. I would like force fit it into conversations, and my schoolmates would be like, what are you smoking? Things like even my college essay, for example. So the book starts, Sense of an Ending starts with a list of memories, just a random list of memories that this man has about his life. I love that. And then through the novel, all of these memories come together in a narrative. And I use that format for my college essays. One of the memories being me peeing on my brother when I was really young. Like it's so taking being so I don't know if I was moved by the book as much as I was in awe of the style of writing.
Hmm.
In the same vein, like Rushdie, Salman Rushdie's book in Midnight's Children, there's a phrase called rainbow riot,
Hmm.
and or he would describe the moon as creamy,
Hmm.
you know. And so these adjectives, these adverbs, I would sort of pick them up and sort of lodge them in my brain somewhere, and I would use them in my writings. So that, I suppose, is the most direct incarnation of the word influence. But there have been to, uh, writers whom I've always wanted to become some version
Okay.
of. One of them was Anita Desai.
Okay.
Uh, because so what happened? I used to never read very much as a kid growing up. I used to be like I used to be out and about. But then I shifted schools, and it was from a little more posher school to a little more middle class school. And I was very snooty about the whole thing and decided that I didn't need friends. So I retreated almost. And one of the things that held me in good stead at that time was my English teacher in the eighth grade,
Okay.
Miss Janjani, and she pushed me towards books.
Okay.
She told and like it's like she's like, read, and I was like, what do I read? Like I had no conception of reading, right? I had read what Harry Potter and Roald Dahl. I mean, the most clear memory of reading was my mom used to come pick us up from school, and I was reading all of Roald Dahl at that time. This was like when I was really young, and I would sit on in the back seat on the floor, and I would lounge against the door, and I would just be reading. And I grew up in Dubai, and so like there was that harsh Dubai sunlight trickling in. It was the afternoon, right? And I would just be reading Roald Dahl for those 45 minutes every afternoon. But that I mean, I didn't read because I loved. It was just something that happened that I never took reading seriously till I moved schools. And she was like, "You should read," and I was like, "What do I read? I don't know anything." And she suggested Chitra Banerjee,
Okay.
uh, and so I went to the local library that we had in Dubai, and I said, "Give me Chitra Banerjee." And they were like, "Who?" And I was like, "I don't know, Chitra Banerjee." And they were like, We only have Anita Desai." And so I went, and they had this whole rack of just Anita Desai, and I picked up In Custody. That was the first book I picked up. And I was so moved by the silence and the pace of a language. It suddenly stilled life, right?
Hmm.
Suddenly you were like you're running in a certain with certain motions, and then you enter a book, and then it's like a sigh almost, right? You're just okay. Her descriptions used to tire me sometimes and bore me sometimes, but I remember reading Fasting Feasting and was just bowled over sometimes. Like I would be reading a page and I would just be bored, and then suddenly there would be a description, and I'd be like, Jesus, this is it just like struck you on the head almost. And so after that, of course, what you do is then you go on YouTube and then you watch all the videos, you read everything that's written about her.
Yeah.
And I remember telling my mother, she's an old woman, and so she speaks very conscientiously. Every word that comes out of her mouth is calculated beauty, is how I would put it. Like it's calculated, but it doesn't sound rehearsed. There's something so
Hmm.
beautiful that comes out of it at the same time. And I remember telling my mother back then that I want to be this. So she was, I don't know if it was an influence as much as an ideal that I had in my head.
Hmm.
I just want to make that distinction um, between the two because she certainly was one of them. Uh, Parul Sehgal is to this day one of the influences that I have. She's a literary critic. She used to write for the New York Times and now she writes for the New Yorker. Uh, and she taught me something which I will always hold very close to my heart, which is the most important thing for a writer to be is charming.
Interesting.
It's uh, like, let me hold your hand and walk you through this piece that I have written. You know,
Huh.
that kind of sit beside me while I explain why I like this film, why I didn't like this film. Um, and very recently, I think Jerry Pinto has been on my mind because I finished reading The Education of Yuri, and I've this is something I've been struggling for a long time, which is that how do you dislike something without being ironic about it or sarcastic about it? Like, what is the language like when you don't like a film, right?
Hmm.
The criticism or the critics or just generally the language that we use is often of sarcasm and irony, right? Oh, that Salman Khan film, and like the critics are just having fun belting out these, really pointed, ironic statements, and it's very fun to read. But fundamentally, I'm thinking about like how do you, and in Pinto's book, yeah, Education of Beauty, there's a line which is like, is it easier to be clever than to be sincere?
Hmm.
And uh,
Yeah.
uh, I've I've been struggling with that a bit because it's like, what is the language we used in conversations in life to describe something we don't like?
Hmm.
Can we grapple with it as something sincerely, or what is this urge for irony that we have?
Yeah.
You know, yeah, I suppose so. These are just broadly people who've pushed me in directions that I wouldn't have otherwise thought of if it weren't for them, I suppose.
Yeah, no, that's great, and I think you left us a lot to think about, especially with that part about Jerry Pinto. And I think the fact that yeah, it is. Is it easier to be clever than sincere? That's it's funny because that's actually something even I've been thinking about a lot in recent times. So yeah, it's definitely something worth mulling over. But yeah, I think sort of moving more into your sort of career trajectory. So you studied economics at Berkeley, and you had an interest in policy, which you did go on to work at JPAL. So how did you decide to get into that space, and what was, I guess, that phase of your career like for you?
In the ninth standard, we were introduced to economics, and this is CBSE, so this is like very bare bones economics. It's barely economics, actually, if you look at it. But I remember the first week of learning this new subject. It's a new subject, right? And there's some excitement. Uh, I remember coming back thinking, I want to do a PhD in this and teach.
Oh wow,
Okay.
okay.
Um, and I mean, I come from a family where, teaching is given a kind of priority that few professions are given. given a priority and importance and respect that few professions are given. And so it just made sense for me um, to want to go in that direction. And so economics seemed to be exactly what it is. And that love for economics remained through ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th. And then, of course, in college, it just made natural sense that I would study economics. Within the first year, I realized that I don't want just to do economics because it was sort of, it dulls when you hang out with the same kind of people, the same ideas, keep regurgitating. And so I did a double degree in Urdu with South Asian studies with an Urdu emphasis because I just wanted to see if I could just push myself in two directions and, you know, be okay with it in a certain sense. Uh, but even within economics, of course, you have to specialize and you have to realize what is it in economics that you like. And in the third year, we did this course on development economics, where taught by Edward Miguel, and he and his mentor had did this experiment in Africa on deworming kids. It
Okay.
was a randomized controlled trial, and they dewormed the treatment group, and they compared how the two were doing. uh, they realized that it was a very powerful intervention because the children who were dewormed were studying more, they were studying better,
Okay.
and it was a sensational result in a time where people were trying to figure out how to keep people in school, how to keep children in school. And the Africa government picked it up and they eventually dewormed 5 million kids based on
Okay.
this research.
Okay.
India took it up and then India dewormed the kids. So this is one of the few examples of an economic research project which has policy implications uh, to a point where they also got additional funding to study how are these kids doing when they enter the job force. And they found out that kids who are dewormed end up earning more, doing better jobs, greater skills. And so I remember very clearly weeping in class, thinking about here is the economics that I think I want to do, right? Because we
Okay.
are, of course, I was like 18 or 19 or whatever, and you have this ghost in your head saying that you're going to change the world, and you're trying to find the most efficient way to do that. And you're realizing that maybe I struck gold. Like, this is it. And so I did a few more courses in development economics, and I knew I was going to do a PhD in that specific field.
Okay.
I was going to apply for a PhD directly out of my undergrad, and then my advisor at that time, Supreet Kaur, she told me, "Why don't you just do field work for 2 years or a year or two to just see how these experiments that you're writing about is takes place?"
Yeah.
And I like that idea. And so I applied to JPAL, a few projects, which was working across South Asia, Southeast Asia. They have a huge portfolio of experiments, mostly randomized controlled trials, all in development economics, cutting edge research, working with some of the finest professors across the globe. And I got to work with Professor Sean Cole, who was working, he's at Harvard Business School, and he was working with farmers in rural Gujarat at that time, trying to do an experiment with an agricultural information system saying that if we give you more timely information to farmers about their crops and the pests, what does it do to the yields? What does it do to the amount of the bargaining power that they have in markets and mandis? What does it do to their lifestyle? What does it do to the education of the kids? So this was the experiment that we're doing, and we got funding from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for this. Uh, and the early results of the experiment were very positive, and so the Odisha government decided to take up and do another large scale thing. So
Okay.
I was sort of shuttling between rural Gujarat and rural Odisha for a year and a half, and we were doing this big experiment. Um, but then what happened was slowly I was not excited by the data that we were collecting. So I was training the surveyors and we were going to the fields and conducting these interviews. And then I was seeing how these interviews were being, the data was coming out of it and then it was being analyzed and then it was being presented in these conferences. And so I was seeing that whole sort of life cycle of data and I was losing interest in data
Okay.
because I was realizing that in these, we'd have these hour-long interviews with these farmers, hour-long, hour and a half sometimes. And I would see the farmer not exactly engaging with us because we were looking for very specific kind of answers. And they were sort of throwing numbers at us essentially. Um, and that's always a limitation of data. And we knew this walking into the field that, you're not going to get exact answers and exact numbers. That's just not how people think generally, right? Like if I ask you how much did you spend yesterday, exactly in rupees, you're not going to give me an answer that is sort of going to satisfy my research hypotheses in a certain sense. But just doing this day in, day out I was just sort of losing my excitement with data, number one. And of course, I was in rural Gujarat for 3 months, and I was sort of living in a hotel on the highway, and it was just very lonely also at that time.
Okay.
I'd get up in the morning and I would just have my sickly sweet tea, poha, in which also they put sugar, and just, staring at the cars go by. And sometimes a bus would come with passengers and sit in the dhaba, and it was a very incredibly lonely time. So I think all of these simultaneously, these things were happening, and I decided I can't do a PhD in this because I think to do a PhD in something, you have to have an absolute conviction in
Yeah.
that field, right? Have you thought of doing a PhD at any time? Is that
Yeah, kind of, but we will not get into that right now.
because it's just like when I talk to people who've wanted to do PhDs and didn't end up doing, it's the same story that comes out, right? Like you're just so excited by an idea, and then you realize maybe I'm not excited enough to pursue a
Yeah.
PhD. Like PhD is it's it's a kind of labor that is unimaginable for someone who hasn't
Yeah.
done it. And so the next best thing I thought I could do was write. And so I decided to put my papers in, and I said the last month of my work I'd do it remotely from Mumbai because it's just analysis work and cleaning data, which I could do remotely anyways. And also, if I'm like Mumbai, I came to Mumbai because my grandmother lives here, my uncle and aunt live here, so I could live with them. I
Okay.
won't have to sort of sell my kidney to pay rent. Uh, and also, Mumbai is sort of the central for writing and writers. And I thought something will happen, right? Like, let me just come, and figure it out as I move through the city. So yeah, I came here. It was April 2019. Uh, April 2019, I think it was. Yeah, I came right before the election, so I could vote. Uh, and yeah, then I just sort of moved around, and I realized that a lot of uh, writing is just finding and building networks.
Hmm. Okay.
Uh, and my first two jobs. So what was I don't know. I don't know if I'm digressing too much because
No,
the
but
idea is
I think we are going in a really good flow because what I did want to ask you next is you did make the switch to sort of, going into a writer zone professionally and kind of then diving into film journalism and culture writing. So I am definitely curious to know how that transition happened for you because how do you go from economics and public policy to like something that is so different, from what you originally started with?
we're being reckless. I think that's the short answer. Again, the thing about this story is that we often look at people's life stories and think they're somewhat replicable, but I think the
Hmm.
circumstances that and the matrices, just the unique things that happened, I don't think it will happen again. So I don't want anyone to sort of listen to this and think this can happen to them.
Yeah.
It might, but I think what these stories generally tend, because I'm saying this because I used to think like that too, right? Because when I was in Ahmedabad, thinking about moving to writing, I was talking to all of these writers, and they'd have these bizarre stories of how they walked into writing and thinking this might happen to me. Of course, it didn't, but that's just a disclaimer of sorts. But I had at that time, I was sort of emotionally grappling with this person. And it was the time when Kalank had released the film.
Okay.
And so we were having this really long conversation about that film on chat. And it's like when you're emotionally invested in a person, you give your like 100-word messages, 200-word messages, 300-word
Yeah.
messages. And so that was what was happening. So there was just like really long messages being sent back and forth about that film. That film reminded me a lot of. Uh, I thought like I didn't like that film very much, and I was sort of using why I liked Saawariya so much to talk about why I didn't like this, like what worked in Saawariya that, and he was trying to do the same things here, which didn't work in a certain sense, and um, it was why I think I'm talking about the emotional investment is that it made me just want to write to him about the film. So it wasn't
Hmm.
the film that made me want to write; it was him that made me want to write about the film. Um, and around the same time, Film Companion had started the first. It was some contest, I suppose, where they just said like send your reviews and the best review will go on the website. It was the first edition they were doing, and Kalank was the first one. And I was like, I have already written a 1,500 word thesis on this on chat. So I just collected all of it and I put it into one document. I edited it lightly and I sent it. And I forgot about it.
Okay.
And then when I was at a friend's place in Ahmedabad, not very sober, and I was sort of scrolling through Twitter, and suddenly Bharadwaj Rangan, the critic, had put out like he tweeted about that review, and I was like, oh, I didn't even realize that one. I didn't realize that he liked the review and he sort of tweeted about it, and I was like, should I message him for a job? Because that was around this time that I had just put in my papers. And the friend was like, don't be desperate about it. Like, give it a day or two. And I was like, I am desperate. I don't mind him knowing I'm desperate. It's not like, what am I going to do holding on to my self-respect? I need a job. Um, and so I immediately messaged him, and Barry is just one of the kindest souls. And so he immediately put me in touch with Mohini, who was the associate editor from Companion at that time. I emailed her with samples. And when I moved to Bombay, I sort of met her, and she thought it was a good fit. And so I started working 3 days a week. And it was 3 days a week because I had also got another gig simultaneously with Parmeshani,
Okay.
the sort of I call him the gay Gatsby of Bombay. He's just the most stunning human being that you will ever come across. Uh, he was working on his book Queeristan at that time, and he wanted a researcher.
Hmm.
Now I didn't know very much about him, but I was the kind of person I was. Anyone who I met on the streets, in friends and parties, I was like, "I'm going to Bombay. Do you know anyone who wants a writer?" And I was one of those people. So
Okay.
a friend of a friend uh, was like, she came across Parmesh's post saying that he's looking for a researcher, and she tagged me in it on
Okay.
that post. And I was like, great. So I just sent in my email, forgot about it. And then I moved to Bombay, and of course, we did an interview, and he thought it was a good fit. And so I started working on that 3 days a week. So that was my first job. And then
Wow.
simultaneously, the film companion thing happened. And so I was like, already have this 3 days a week. Do you mind if I do film companion 3 days a week? And they were like, not at all. So sort of I was doing the 3 days a week, 3 days a week thing. And that's just how I moved into writing. In between, I was thinking of doing like radio writing. I had
Ooh.
spoken to some
Okay.
radio. Yeah, yeah. I was just sort of throwing everything at the wall. I remember at that time Jet Airways um had just shut down, and so a lot of people were laid off, and so
Yeah.
some editor. So Jet Airways had just laid off a bunch of people, and so this editor had put out a tweet saying that if you're from Jet Airways, you can reach out to me. And I was like, I'm not from Jet Airways. Can I still reach out? So I was literally throwing everything at the wall because I had no network and I knew no one in the city. Um, and even my uncle and aunt were like really helpful, and they were putting me in touch with like writers and screenwriters. And at that time, I didn't know if I wanted to get into screenwriting specifically.
Hmm.
And these two things just happened simultaneously, organically, and I was very excited about both of them because Film Companion, of course, I've been watching for a long time since it came out in 2015. It started, I think, and Parmesh was just, I think, the moment I met him, it was I was just electrified by his personality. He walked in
Nice.
with a boat. He worked in Godrej at that time, and so he walked in into his sort of. He started this culture lab in Godrej, which was just sort of this incubator of some of the finest work and events that was happening. He was trying to make sort of put Vikhroli on the cultural map in a certain sense. And he walked in with his bow tie. And so I walked into Godrej office. So at that time, I was going through my shawl phase. Stole phase. So I would wear a
Okay.
stole, everything I wore. And I remember, I think I wore, it was this electric blue Leheria print stole. And I walked into Vikhroli, and I removed it as I walked into Godrej because it felt odd. Because everyone is walking around with their ties and their
Yeah.
formals and the click click of the boots. I was in my choppers, in my denims, and I was like, I'm already standing out. Like, how much more do I want to stand out? And so I removed it and I put it into my bag, and then I sit down and I wait for him, and he walks in with his bow tie, his pink bow tie that you could spot from a mile. And I thought, my God, this is this. It requires a very different level of not just confidence but irreverence to not worry too much about what other people think. These were two jobs that simultaneously, but also was very very excited by, and I learned everything about writing through these jobs because I was not formally trained as a writer. Of course, I never moved in that direction. Most of the writing that I did, even in college, was academic. So a lot of the writing here was unlearning that academic style of writing. Um, yeah, so I suppose that's just how I made my entry into writing.
Yeah, which is amazing. And I know obviously everyone has their own journey with this, and it is independent of a lot of things. And it's difficult to compare, but I think it is just kind of sort of inspiring in some ways to hear about these journeys and be like, hey, it's great that this happened for someone. Yeah, of course, it leaves you with a hope sometimes that maybe it could happen to me. But I think it's also the sort of courage and conviction with which you sort of went after it, right? Like you said, you were sort of just throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks, and it did stick. That's the best part. You took that chance, and more power to you for that. But since you made the switch, I'm curious, like, did people have anything to say when you were switching from like economics and policy and research work to like sort of a more culture writing film journalism space? Like, I don't know, did family and friends say anything at all, or was
No,
it just complete
my dad
support
and my
throughout?
mom have always been very supportive. Uh, the only thing they wanted me to be was sure of what I wanted to do.
Hmm.
Even my uncle, for that matter. Like sometimes, I remember we had this long conversation because I moved. It was a radical shift, and he was like, and my uncle is someone who worked in a company from when he was like in his early 20s, and he stayed with his company and he might be retiring soon, and he is now at the top of that company. So he's of that culture and the generation which sort of you stay with one job, you stay with one
Yeah.
portfolio, and you move through it.
Yeah.
Um and so he was like, you're making the shift to writing, are you sure? I was like, I'm sure for now. I can't predict what I'm going to feel 10 years from now. 10 years from now, I want to move back to economics. And that freaked him out, my uncle out. He was like, you need to be sure about what you're doing, which is, quite fair. So the thing always was, if I was sure of what I was doing, there was no anxiety in their voice and their ideas because they're like, something will work out. Eventually, something will work out. It was only when I was unsure of what I wanted, when I was expressing or articulating either despair, either some sort of um, instability. That was when I think they were a little, uh, they were a little unsure. Because also, I mean, I have to mention this that I come from a family of immense privilege. Like like my father always was like, we can, like, you don't have to worry too much about money, at least for the first few years. Like, we can be there for you if you want. And of course, I had a house in Bombay that I could move into without paying rent, without sort of killing myself. Though I did have savings when I shifted my job. I was very clear that even when I was in Japan, I was like, I have to make a certain amount of money and then leave so that I have this buffer that I have. But there was just this immense privilege that was a cushion, almost an emotional cushion. It wasn't just monetary. Of course, it was monetary, but it was just this emotional cushion that I had, that I didn't have to worry about how to make next month's rent, how to think about those things. So I think all of that also helped immensely. But they never. Their uh, excitement or their anxiety was very much linked to my excitement and my anxieties, which
Hmm.
is, I suppose, a healthy way of being.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's amazing because, for better or worse, unfortunately, a lot of people don't get that kind of support, right? So, and I think having that support makes a huge difference, right, to anyone. It's like one less battle to fight because you're already kind of dealing with so much. So, I think it's incredible that you did have that kind of support and sort of that system around you, in a way. But now that you are sort of writing and you're doing this full time, do you face any kind of like misconceptions or assumptions about your day job, which are just absurd and you're like, no, this is not true?
I think one is that we hang out with stars all the time, like film
Really?
stars. It's something that I get often. They're like, "Oh, you must have met Shahrukh, you must have met Salman," and I was like, "You don't know how low in the hierarchy we are."
Okay.
I think that is one misconception people have, that we just, and of course, the other one is the money. And I have to mention this, that there's not much money in writing. Um, Not just that it's not much money, but when you're a green writer, you don't even have the confidence to ask for money because you don't know what your worth is. You don't know what the market rate is. You don't know what publications are willing to pay, not willing to pay. You're
Yeah.
just so excited by just the being given the platform to write. Um, I suppose at that time, but yeah. So one of the thing this they think that there's a lot of money in it, which is not the case, and they think that, and of course, I think with critics and criticism, there's this unsaid assumption that a lot of paid critics, you're paid by publication houses, you're given gifts and this and that, which of course isn't, in our case, in Film Companion's case, at least I can say it's not true. Um, but I, of course, know of critics who do get paid. I know of critics who, for some films, have to, tone down their objectives.
Hmm.
But yeah, these are some of the misconceptions, I suppose, that people have about writing.
One of the other things I did want to ask you is that, and I've read like a couple of pieces, and I think I've personally sort of messaged you about them as well, and said that, hey, I really, love the way you've written certain pieces, and I truly do. Like each time I feel like I read a piece written by you, I feel like I just come out feeling a little smarter, and I feel like, oh my god, these past like how many ever minutes was so worthwhile of just spending it on this piece of writing or content or whatever. But something fascinating is that you have a very distinctive style of writing, and the reason I say distinctive is I feel like, at least the more I've you're one of those writers, I feel like you have a certain way of sort of presenting information or pieces and opinions, where you could be talking about, like for example, if I had to look back even at a paper you had done at Berkeley on homosexuality, and you're talking about law and history and culture, and suddenly there's a mention of like ghazals and how that's becoming so like binary, and they're trying to like genderize that. So it's really fascinating how you manage to kind of weave so many different elements, and at no point does it ever feel overwhelming or like info dumping, and yet it's driving home a point. And I feel like that's a very you style, that's a very Prathyush Parasuraman style of writing, as I'd like to call it, because I don't see very many writers who are able to do that and do it with such a strong voice, with such strong conviction. So how do you kind of develop your own, that kind of voice of writing? Because I mean, I'm sure, I mean, I don't know if it comes overnight, but I'm sure there is a process. So how is it for you?
I, I mean, the two separate things, and one is about voice, and one is about the content that the voice is, in some sense, being foundational to. With voice, I've learned this over time. It's not something that you can wander consciously towards. It's
Hmm.
something that you unconsciously arrive at, if that makes sense. You,
Okay.
I cannot force fit a voice and work towards it, you know? Uh, because the thing about a voice is that it has to seem natural. The thing about a voice is it's something that unconsciously emerges from all the reading that you do.
Hmm.
which is why I think one of the most important things for a critic, even a film critic, to do is to read. People think that a film critic needs to watch a lot of movies, which is true. But one thing that they don't think about is that a film critic needs to read, because reading provides you that avenue to unconsciously absorb certain styles, active versus passive, what kind of a line you want to start with, how much of the first person do you want to use, um, do you want to use M dashes, do you want to use semicolons, uh, how many adjectives do you use? One of my favorite art critics, Jerry Saul, sometimes his whole paragraph is just a collection of adjectives,
Okay.
right? And it's just like, and what that does is, it's not about describing a work of art as much as just you're seeing this critic grapple with something, this painting, and he's just flinging words at it, trying to, in some sense, approximate that sensual interaction that he's had with that work of art, which is fundamental. You're not able to translate, right? It's a visceral experience, and you're trying to put into words. It's just impossible. And what he's trying to do with that paragraph of adjectives is just give us a sense of him grappling with that impossibility. Now, these are things that you pick up only by reading, I suppose. So that is voice, and I don't know if I can be more helpful because it's just something that is I've changed also over time, right? If I read some of the stuff that I used to write in 2019, I want to bury myself into a hole and hibernate forever because it's just uh, so not just untrained, but there's something so unfinished about it.
Hmm.
Like there are thoughts that I feel like one more sentence I could have written about. But in my
Hmm.
head, it was a complete idea. But on paper, 2 years later reading it, it feels incomplete. Even a small thing like I was not able to make the distinction between an N dash and an M dash.
Yeah.
I was not making that distinction in my writing in 2019. So when I go back to those pieces, there's like a visceral cringe that happens because, and of course, punctuation is very much part of a voice as a writer, at least. So that is just something that you arrive at. And the way you arrive at it is by absorbing as much reading as you can. Um, Good reading. I think Arundhati Roy said this really well that when you're a writer, you're not just reading anymore, you're reading conscientiously,
Yeah.
right? Because you suddenly picking up style, you're picking up words like, rainbow light and creamy moon and philosophically self-evident and all of that. Uh, you're picking up these things, you're picking up styles, you're picking up uh, like for example, like would you write in first person or not is something that I still grapple with because I feel uncomfortable with the first person. I feel that
Okay.
um it lends itself to the personal essay form, which I've always been very off for a long time. So, things like that, I think you learn over time, you arrive at. But when it comes to what is in it, like the references, the sort of the raw material from which you're sort of sculpting the piece, it's again all about reading conscientiously, taking notes, having a system where you're able to go back to these things and refer to it.
But then, okay, how do you sort of review books versus film? Because I know you do both. Is that process different for you, or are they actually very much the same?
So book reviewing happened during the pandemic. What was happening was I moved back to my parents' place in Madurai, near Madurai, and I had nothing to do because I knew no one there. You could go out. So what I would shift my work days. I would start working at like 6:37 in the morning, and I'd finish by like 2:33, and so I'd have the rest of the day free, and so I would just read books. It came to a point where I would read like a book every 2 days, and there was always Amazon parcels coming home, and a lot of money was being spent. And I thought I was trying to be smart, and I said, what if I get paid to write, and so that payment about books, and that payment would sort of I would be able to write books that I want to read about. I would read anyways, and I wouldn't have to pay for those books because I would get press copies or whatever. A terrible decision in hindsight because the problem is that when you begin to uh, labor in what you leisure generally, it changes your relationship to leisure in a way that
Oh.
cannot be undone.
Hmm.
Right? If you take something that you love and you make it work and you attach money to it, then it ruins something. Not everything. I mean, the joy of reading still exists, but it certainly did something to my relationship to literature. Uh, I mean, the reviewing process of books and movies is very different in the sense that with a book you can stay with a sentence. The movie is sort of it's just whizzing past you, and so you almost there's an insecurity while watching a movie of like you not being able to hold on to details.
Hmm.
With books, that's not the case, right? Because you can underline it, you can make notes about it, you can go over it again and again. Of course, with streaming movies, that was not the case, but generally with film criticism, you walk into a theater, it's dark. People take notes in the theater. I want to be the kind of person who takes notes, but I just am not able to. That's just not me. What I usually just do is on my phone take note of the names of the characters because I tend to forget
Hmm.
that very
Okay.
often. That's something I'm very not very good at. Um, but I think fundamentally they're just such different uh, genres that you walk in with different insecurities, you walk in with different expectations and excitements, right? With a book versus a film. The time also that you're investing, you're watching a film in an hour and a half. A book sometimes takes you, like I was reviewing Hanya Yanagihara's book, to Paradise, and I was like, an 800-page book. It took me a week to get through that. So your
Hmm.
engagement with the work is also that much longer,
Yeah.
and because your engagement with the work is longer, you're thinking about it constantly, right? You're in the shower and you're thinking about it, you're eating food and you're thinking about it, you're going to sleep and you're thinking about it. And so it's right, book reviews is a little more consuming than film reviews in
Hmm.
that sense. But then when it comes to writing, I think it's just the fundamental act of criticism, which is just trying to express what you felt, uh,
Hmm.
and trying as little as possible to reverse engineer your feelings.
Okay.
Because what happens is a lot of times you get more clarity on what you thought while writing. And this is something
Hmm.
people don't realize.
Yeah.
That with criticism, that they think that we have an idea in our head that, okay, this is it, and then you sort of just like sitting and writing it. But it's through the act of writing that very often ideas emerge. And then you are stuck with it because you're like, what do I do with this? Right?
Hmm.
Because this is an idea that emerged from me while writing it. It might not necessarily have been a thought that I had while watching it or while reading it.
Hmm. Hmm.
And then suddenly you're grappling with this idea of what do you bring to criticism? Do you bring that immediacy of feeling when you're reading and watching it? Is that what the criticism should be about? Or should it just be broader about how you sort of struggle with and think about a book over a period of time? Like I'll give you a very good example, Liger, the film that came out last this year. Awful film.
I
And
haven't
like
watched it.
it's quite trashy. And I was
That's why I didn't
having
watch
a book.
it.
It's a as a viewing experience, it's just a little fascinating that because I was in the theater and I was just laughing through it, like laughing at the film for the most part, but just laughing through it. And then I came out of the theater and then I was on the train home and I was sort of writing some of the paragraphs that I wanted that I had in my head. And then I was also simultaneously listening to the director, Puri Jagannath's podcast. So he had his podcast, inspirational podcast. I don't know if you can see my eyes roll, but they're very much rolling. And in it, one of the is about women and what he thinks women should be and whatever.
Okay.
And I was just so infuriated by that. And what happened was that fury of listening to that podcast was sort of imposed onto my experience of the film.
Okay.
I wasn't necessarily angry at the film, but while writing about the film, that anger sort of just coalesced. And then then I was of course struggling with it. It's like I don't like should anger be there in the tone? But I did feel anger at some point, not in the theater, but I felt towards the film because I was seeing so much of what he was talking about women in the female character and how he treats them.
Hmm.
Uh, and that's patronizing, idolizing, almost indifference to the feminine presence in the film. Like if a woman is strong, that's all she is. She's just screaming and ranting and raving. If a woman is coy, that's all she is. Um, So yeah, I mean that you're constantly struggling with that in any form of criticism, literary or film. But broadly, I don't think I the writing isn't different. It's just the grappling with the text of the film that's where the difference is.
Hmm. No, that's interesting because especially since you kind of review these two very different mediums. So I was just curious as to how you kind of
I don't do
go
book
about it.
reviews anymore. I think I've stopped doing that.
Okay. But I mean, you were, so that's why I was just wondering. I was like, how different or similar is this process for you? But then having said that, what makes a story good for you?
That's a very complicated question. Because it not just because it has many answers, but the answer also changes
Yeah,
depending
for
on,
sure.
yeah.
So at this
So
point in
right
time, what
now,
makes a story good for you?
to take beauty seriously, to take desire seriously, I think right now is what I've been thinking about a lot because I've this is barrage of films that are taking neither seriously or are
Okay.
fetishizing both to a point where it's. I mean, have you seen Color, the film?
Yeah,
Anita?
I did.
It's on
I
Netflix.
did.
Like, it didn't work for me at all. I thought it was doing this thing of almost fetishizing beauty to a point of it not having an effect. The point of beauty is like to be moved by it. If there's beauty and if you're not moved by it, then is it beauty really? And what is it? The point of beauty is to be moved by it, right? Like, why do we say that word beauty? Like, beauty is not an aesthetic word. It's very much pungent. It's full of feeling. And if you're not feeling that, then is it beauty? Desire, I think, is the same thing. But mostly, I just don't want to be talked down to. I think a lot of, or talked up to. I don't want films to either think I'm stupid or too smart.
Okay.
I think directors tend to have a sense of like who their audience is, and they sort of cater to just that. And sometimes I feel like the director thinks I'm just really stupid,
Okay.
and sometimes I feel like the director thinks I'm a little too smart, and neither work for me. Either it's not that yeah, I suppose that's what I think a good story is, to just not talk down to me, talk up to me, just talk to me.
Hmm.
Why is that so difficult?
I like the way you put that across actually. I mean, just say what you need to say it the way you think you need to say it, but don't try to patronize or don't try to like treat me as if I'm superior. Just be. I think that's the context I'm getting, which is actually so true when you think about it. Um, but yeah, I think, sort of shifting gears a little bit. I know you're really vocal about, issues, and not just issues, but just generally about, the LGBTQI plus community, be it, with your own experiences or just your observations in general. And it comes across very clearly, in your writing and just a lot of the things you put out. And I did watch that presentation you did on that paper for Berkeley, which is Do Homosexuals Cause Earthquakes? Reframing the Queer Disposition, which I enjoyed very much, I have to say. But, my question to you is what has your relationship been like with gender identity and sexual orientation? And the reason I'm asking this is because I don't think we have enough open conversation about this in general, especially in a South Asian context. And I feel like we're so used to kind of pushing it under the carpet or not talking about it enough that then people are so wary of talking about it and talking about their own truth and authenticity. So, yeah, what has it been like for you?
It's fairly complicated, and I'm using that word again. But what I mean when I say complicated is, um, there's this sense that there's a community and that you must belong to it. And I've always chafed at that idea because I have always been innately doubtful of ideas of community.
Okay.
Because what a community does is it provides comfort. And what that comfort lets you do is it simplifies certain things, which I demand complexity from. For example, around Section 377, which criminalized anal sex, a lot of people were saying that it made homosexuality illegal.
Mm,
But that was not
okay.
technically true,
Yeah.
right? It was the act of anal sex that was considered unnatural, for which people could be uh, imprisoned. Now, part of me was like, how do we talk about this? Because a lot of people in the rhetoric, they were being swept by the rhetoric of it, and they were like, this is makes queer people illegal.
Hmm.
And my thing was that it is because if you're looking at what it was just a fascinating philosophical question, right? The relationship between homosexuality and homosexual sex. Like, what's that relationship? You
Yeah.
know, like if you're saying that to be homosexual, it needs to have anal sex, then of course it's true that to be homosexual would be illegal. But what is that relationship between the identity and the sexual act? Was one question that I was grappling with. But also, what is the uh, incarnation of this law in the real lives of people, right? So in the paper, I was studying it historically to see how are they establishing anal sex, and of course they would say things like this person has an anus shaped like a trumpet, so
Yeah.
that means they have been sodomized, and so of course that means that they are, illegal because you can't catch people in the act, right? So you have to figure out these you have to fabricate evidence almost. And I was trying to figure out what is this evidence you're fabricating on the basis of which you're cementing this identity of homosexuality. In contemporary India, there was a Matunga racket, for example, where you would have police officers who would come in normal clothes and they would sort of exchange gay porn. And then while they were doing that, they would sort of catch the person who's holding onto the porn
Hmm.
saying that this is evidence that, you've been sodomized. And of course, that wouldn't hold in a court of law, but most of these men were either sort of married or they were not out to their families. And so, you know, what the police was doing was not using the act, but using the anxiety of the act to prey on these people, right? Because
Hmm.
if someone knew the act, they knew that these are not evidence that sort of hold in a court of law. And so I was constantly chafing at the platitudes and the rhetoric of the movement at that time. And I remember the reason I wrote that piece was because um, Shashi Tharoor had very movingly spoken about in favor of sort of getting the 377 abolished. And he'd said that he sort of located homophobia in the colonial period. He was like, before, he sort of located that as a sort of starting point, the origin story of homophobia. And I was very unsure of that. It made sense, right? Like it's a convenient narrative to have, but I was just not sure because what is the raw material? What is the evidence? What's the data on the basis of which you're saying this?
Hmm.
It's not like pre-British India was sort of some queer heaven, right? There's a lot of evidence of the violence that was being inflicted on queer bodies, even as they were, part of the courts, as they were part of the royal, uh, the palanquins, and this and that. So the paper came from just trying to investigate historically where is this homophobia coming from? Can we locate alternative ways of thinking of Section 377? And so I've always shifted the idea of these convenient ways of talking about of queerness specifically. Um, and I don't know how much of that is my insecurity with sexuality. That it could be that,
Okay.
right? Because one thing is that you're insecure about something, and the easiest way to get over that, or get through that, or get by that is by logic, trying to use logic as a sort of coping mechanism to get through whatever you're feeling. I've done this a lot growing up, and I suppose this might be just one incarnation of that. Uh, Me being very uncomfortable with this idea of queer solidarity, and so I'm using logic to get over that. I'm trying to use sort of philosophical arguments to sort of dilly-dally around it. That might be my limitation as someone who's still figuring out what my relationship to the larger queer community is. Uh, but yeah, I suppose that's what when I think about right now my relationship with queerness, it's entirely about desire, right? Because for me, I think that's so fundamental to queerness, and I bring that into a lot of my writing. I bring that into a lot of how I think about films, how I think about books. um I was talking to a friend over, really old monk and Chinese bale and the other night, and I said something and I thought, my God, I said it, and It made sense. It was just something that just like yanked out of my body. I didn't really think this through. Just like, if you want to take a character seriously, you give them desire in a book, in a film.
Hmm.
And perhaps that's one way to think about which are the characters the filmmaker, the director, the writer does not want to take seriously. The one that they don't give
Interesting.
desire to is the one that they don't. Is just a hypothesis that I just sort of spilled out in that moment. Uh, but I think largely right now, as it is, my relationship with queerness is one of desire, and I'm trying to figure out the larger politics of it, right? Because I'm still, uh, I don't, I don't philosophically understand a lot of the positions that people in the queer community take.
Okay.
Uh, and I don't want to agree to it simply because it seems the most convenient thing to do. But I also don't want to question it in a way that antagonizes people, right? I
Hmm.
think a lot of the things within the queer community, I mean, and I feel is that when people question you, you feel that they're sort of wielding an axe at you, because that concept of fruitful discussion and questioning is just so rare. And I felt this when people ask me about my queerness, for example, right? Like I don't feel they're questioning as much as accusing me through
Okay.
in the format, in the garb of a question. And so I suppose that's also my discomfort with asking questions around queerness. So it's not a very clear answer because it's not very clear in my head. So
No,
that
and
was the
that's
ramble for
fine.
you.
I think it's just important to have different perspectives on this. And I know at least with the podcast, I at least try to get different perspectives on this because I've had two guests previously on season one, Megha Vasudevan and Sersha, who spoke about this, Um, and they had very different perspectives on this as well. And I think it's just important to have it out there for people to listen to and understand because I think that's what we really lack today. So yeah, more power to you on that. And yeah, the other thing I wanted to ask you was that you've also kind of moved around a lot, right? In terms like while growing up, in terms of schools or cities and countries, and just generally throughout life. So what has kind of belonging and identity been like for you? Sort of belonging to a place and I guess identifying in a way.
There's a so I was traveling around Hampi last year, and I there were these temples, these sixth to eighth century temples. So we are not Hampi, sorry, near Hampi, we went to like Aihole, Badami, and Pattadakal. So there, yeah, these sixth to eighth century temples that were just there, and people were living in their midst, right? So there was this temple that was probably in the seventh century, and you had men just it was a Sunday morning, and you had men just sitting on the temple. It's not a temple where people actively pray anymore. It's just sort of a place almost. And they were just there smoking their beedies. A woman was washing clothes against the rocks of that other temple. And like part of me was like thinking how they're so it's just such a natural part of the landscape. They refuse
Hmm.
to take it out, this temple, and pretend that it's this great heritage and take care of it like heritage. They want to take care of it the way they take care of their own houses, or they
Hmm.
stay in it, or they use it the way they do their houses. But me, sort of being parachuted in with all of this historical knowledge and all of this perspective and all of that, there's a fundamental alienation I feel from that life, that lifestyle, that way of thinking, right? I'm just not able to think like that. The first thing that comes to my head is that this woman is washing her clothes against rocks with sculptures and reliefs from the 7th century. Like, a part of
Hmm.
my heart was like, what is going on? Part of my heart is also like, why should heritage be out there? Why can it not be part of the life? Why can it not erode with that culture?
Hmm.
What is this desire for preservation for centuries that we have, this human instinct? But what I want to bring out through this anecdote is that what I've often felt is that uh, a great distance from any place that I've been in,
Okay.
that distance has provided me perspective that people there wouldn't have, but I've also been fundamentally alienated from these places. So
Okay.
I grew up in Dubai, and
Hmm.
I can never grew up in Dubai and Chennai for a bit, and I've never been able to either master the languages. Like I can speak Tamil, I can barely speak. I can't speak Arabic, honestly. I can read it. But so it's just a fundamental distance from that culture that is always there in my head. What that allows me, that distance allows me a different kind of perspective, right? Which people there wouldn't have, in much the same way that I cannot have the perspective that they have, or just the ease of life with which they move through that space, right? Because in my head, it's like Mahilapur, but Mahilapur people are just like, it's Mahilapur, you know?
Yeah.
Uh, this- so that's just fun. Like, so this idea of belonging is a little complicated, and that's why I think Bombay is closest to home in some sense that I felt in a long time. And one part of me is trying to root myself here by learning the language and failing, of course. And Marathi is just that, like every time someone speaks to me in Marathi and I'm not able to perfectly understand what they're saying, I recognize that there's a distance that
Hmm.
has to be bridged. Um, because I think about Jumpalari a lot when I think about this, where she just sort of just moved to Italy, right? She was in
Hmm.
New York writing in English, and then she decided that no, she wants to write in Italian, and she moved the whole family to Italy to a point where she only read Italian books. She said she wanted to dream in Italian. That's the ideal, right? To dream in this language. That just shows just how subconsciously you're at comfort with language or culture. Um, and so that is something that I've been in moving towards because and when I'm saying that, what I also mean is that belonging doesn't necessarily have to be a natural, incontestable thing. It can also be something that you labor towards. Like I'm laboring
Hmm.
towards belonging to Bombay. This idea of belonging, generally, you feel like it's just this innate thing, right? You just belong to a place, and perhaps that's true. But there's also this other way of thinking of belonging, where it's just you have to put in work to belong to a place. So I suppose that is the long and short of it.
So it's just interesting to get this perspective because I've been in Chennai for most of my life. And it's just sort of fascinating for me to kind of hear from people who've moved around a bit, and what their take is on sort of, I guess, what belonging and identity and identifying as part of a place is like for them. Now we're kind of coming towards the end of this interview, and we always end with these last two questions. So, the first thing I want to ask you is what are your aspirations like? What are you looking forward to in the near or even distant future?
To just write more, to be paid well to write more. Working on a few books, and so hopefully those see the light of day.
Nice.
I think there's this romance of a physical copy in your hand with your name on it, that just never dies. Though print is dying, but that if that image doesn't die, that
I work
aspiration
in
never dies.
publishing. I will not take this to heart, but okay.
I mean, I also work in print essentially, and that's like every time I see it, I'm just not able to. Anyways, I think the rhetoric around that's a little scary, but yeah. So I think just to write more, to be paid to write more, and to be paid well to write more, and be read more. Yeah, I think that would be lovely.
Yeah, for sure. And what is a piece of advice or learning you'd like to share with people? Can be professional, personal, creative, just something you've kind of experienced and wish more people were aware of.
There's something that my advisor Supreet called. So this was after when I was about to graduate, and I was trying to figure out between three experiments which one I wanted to select and do and move to India for. One was two were in Gujarat, one was in Haryana, and I didn't know which one to pick. Um, and I was just, it's a constant conundrum, right? You feel like you have these choices, and all of them are just like equally appetizing, and you think you're going to learn from all of them. And she said something. She's like, there is no right choice. There is no wrong choice. There is just a choice you have to make. Uh, and I think that is something I always think about when I have to make a choice between two things that are equally exciting, but I can only do one of them. Because all of that, always that worry comes in your head, right? Like regret shouldn't descend upon your heart. But yeah, that's something I think about often. That It's more than anything, it's just, it's one of those things like or not a mantra, but just a thing that to just remind you of. Like there's this lovely line in Urdu, ye raat badi tufani hogi, saath raho asani hogi. Just to just hear it, it doesn't have to mean anything. It doesn't have to move you towards any direction in any sense, but just to have it um, on you all the time, like an amulet almost to be that help. And also just the Jerry Pinto quote, which I told you, which is that is it easier to be smart than to be sincere? Is something I've been thinking about because I think sincerity. I've always found sincerity a little boring, to be honest.
Okay, then.
So yeah, but I don't know. I've been maybe I have to change my opinion on that. Because the more I can't stand irony anymore. Like I just can't stand sarcasm. Um, yeah, so maybe these are two things that right now at least have been in my head.
Yeah. And on that enlightening note, I would say we're coming to the end, but we're not because I want to do a fun rapid fire round with you because why not? So, this or that, movies or shows?
Right now, movies in theaters and shows on my laptop.
Okay. Books or the screen?
A terrible question. How do you answer this?
I
At
don't know.
night,
You've
books
dealt with
during
both.
at night, books during the daytime, movies. Yeah,
Okay, fair. Written reviews or video reviews?
written reviews always.
Okay. Filter coffee or adrak chai?
Filter coffee, man. Don't you dare ask this question. There's only one answer.
I'm so glad you answered. That's the right answer. But yeah, anyway. An underrated movie according to you?
Underrated movie.
We have
Um,
established Saawariya, but moving on.
Seven. I think we've given it a little. We've made it a little rated through this conversation for underrated, if that's a thing. I don't know this. Have you seen Lutera? That's a
Yes,
film
I
that.
have.
Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to. In that film, there's this part where he says he wants to go to Chandratal, and that's the place that he's going to find most quietness and solitude. And then he dies in that film, and so he didn't
Yeah.
get to go to Chandratal. And so this time when I went to Himachal, I was like, the one thing in my head I wanted to do was go to Chandratal. I couldn't because of they had closed the highway. But it's one of those films that makes you want to do stupid things like that. It's the point that I'm trying to make.
Okay. An underrated book?
Underrated book. Um, Jesus. Last year there's this lovely book that came out called Name Place Animal Thing. It was
Okay. Yeah.
shortlisted for the JCB.
Hmm.
But it didn't make it. It's just a very sweet coming of age book, and it's again one of those sweet books that you didn't think existed anymore. Because I think right now the cut and thrust of publishing is more towards sort of like almost esoteric translations and like um, it's just a sweet book that I thought deserved more love than it got.
Hmm. Okay. What is the best part about your job?
I say this all the time, which is that to love is to pay attention, and my job is to pay attention. So essentially, like my job is to love. Like I say this like a stuck tape recorder all the time. Like my job is to love.
Oh, that's so sweet. What is the most frustrating part about your job?
I don't get things enough things to love, or I get like I'm forced to pay attention to things that I feel this is an awful thing to say. I'm forced to pay attention to things that just don't deserve my attention. And that's a really snarky thing to say, but it's just what I feel
Hmm.
most of the time.
Hashtag Liger. Anyway, one line. One line for the following. What you feel about these film remakes?
Uh, I think it's fashionable to demean it, but I'm very excited by how uh, hopefully some of these local stories will be culturally translated. I think that's something I always look forward to.
Hmm. Book to screen projects.
Uh, I've always admired people who want to do that. I just wish they did it with less renowned books, more esoteric books, like what Monica or My Darling did, for example,
Yeah.
right? Like take a book that not many people heard of, as
Yeah.
opposed to like a Suitable Boy, which everyone has heard of. Uh,
Yeah. Or a Shantaram right now.
Or Shantanu.
Yeah. Ghazals.
I think uh, it gives language to pain in a way few things can, you
Hmm.
know,
Oh, okay. Okay. So, if your life was made into a biopic, what would the title be?
out and about.
Okay. And who would play you?
Ideally, me. I should play me. I think I'm. I mean,
You could play Ali Sethi in an Ali Sethi biopic, but who would play you?
Alex said he could play me. I think.
Okay, then Ali Sethi it is. Okay, last question. How would you review this interview?
uh, just gentle, affectionate, um, full of curiosity and love.
Aw, thank you. And on that note, we have finally come to the end of this interview. Thank you so much for being here, Pratyush. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Sangeeta, thank you so much for like the thought that you put into the questions and the kindness that you gave to allow me space to ramble.
Thank you. So that was my conversation with Prathyush Parasuraman. I really enjoyed recording this and getting to know him and his story. Closing this episode with an excerpt from a story written and narrated by Prathyush. And with that, we've come to our mid season finale and we're going on a short break. I hope you enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next year with a new guest and a new chronicle to share. Happy holidays and talk real soon.
Okay, how's that? It's called, this is the first chapter of a work in progress novel called The Garlic Renouncer and My First Love. He sheepishly asked me why gay men have so much sex. I was a bit struck, not because of the question itself. I would be lying if I said I hadn't thought of it, but I had always felt wary of milking that thought into a cold question that could be seen as much an accusation as a consideration. He had just graduated from a verdant, polemical, womb-like campus to this violent city of my heart. His balding, influential father fixing him up a job, finance, something, something, with my then boss, whose memoir I was ghostwriting. Not because she did not know how to write, but because she was unwilling to make time to write. Slowly, over the years, she started mistaking the latter for the former, slumping onto her glazed table in pastel pantsuits, repeating how the years have made her shed her hair and her words. I didn't contradict her, for it was the conviction in her miscarried words that got me this job, after all. Our eyes collided for the first time in the restroom as I exited and he entered. It was just 1 second, the door swinging open as I pivoted away from the whirring hand dryer that cloaked my hand in septic summer breath, towards the flung open slab of wood creaking at the hinges as he charged with purpose, briefly looking to his left, finding me, and the gaze lingered till we had moved further along our stride. That to have continued to hold on to the gaze, we would have had to swerve our necks in conspicuous desire. He was beautiful in a cursed, obvious way, the kind who would bite his lip confidently yet subtly, as if he were in deep thought, as if he were unaware of the effect he had on those around, his face returning to my mind's eye through that day in hot flashes, leaving me flushed and longing. That quick gaze began yielding in my head a fantasy, a personality, a myth. I imagined him at a hazy house party in a loose t-shirt, routinely scratching his lower abdomens, a casual invitation to peek at the treasure trail, the soft tufts of hair sailing south from a shallow belly button, just enough for a half, just enough for half a clipped nail to be inserted. His lips were a gesture, an invitation. The ridge parting his nose from his mouth I emphasized in my head, such that if I were to trace the outline of his lips with my index finger, the edges of his upper lip would seem like a wave in a kindergarten ocean. I wondered what his name would sound like in my voice. I wondered how deep, how gruff his throat groaned in the reluctant sleeping mornings. I looked at my watch as I left the restroom almost instinctively and found myself back around the same time, the following afternoon, pretending to leak my bladder into the bone dry urinal, looking around without causing suspicion or alarm, the sort of casual look of a man who's neither interested in looking down at his privates, spit out jaundiced bottled water, or canned soda pushed through the vortex of nephrons, not in staring at the magnesium white wall in front, painted in uneven layers that you want to scratch your freshly cut nails against. He walked in and stood at the urinal next to mine. There were three others he could have chosen from. I counted in my head, smiling. He looked down, but from the corner of my eyes I could see, or perhaps I was just imagining, a pulpy flirt combusting. When I heard his trickle, I realized I had just been standing there, expelling nothing, my privates dangling unnecessarily like dry laundry waiting to be folded in. I zipped up quickly and went to the basin, washing my hands thoroughly, soaping them twice, thrice, waiting for him to occupy the basin next to mine. He did. We blushed, staring at each other's reflections in the mirror, and he strode off without drying his hands.